It's October 28th, and we're in the stand right now, taking advantage of an evening rut cruising stand. Now, to me, there's some very specific ingredients that need to take place with an evening rut cruising stand. Not every evening stand is created equal. I have some stands in this property, some great inside corners. You think, boy, I could hunt there in the evening. They might be great morning spots, because I find that mature bucks will cruise a lot more in the morning hours, relating to bedding areas, relating to away from food sources. And they'll cruise in locations in the morning that they will not cruise in places in the evening, and that's why there are very set and defined morning stands versus evening stands. This happens to be a stand location right here that we can take advantage of morning or evening. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But 3 ingredients you need for an evening rut cruising stand. The first, and I'll talk about what you shouldn't be doing in the evening, but the first one, the downwind edge of food sources. So if I can get on the downwind edge, I can blow my scent into a non-deer area, off a cliff, into a rock, into a marsh. Kind of picture that funnel between a marsh and a food source where it's 80 yards wide, and you're closer to the marsh, blowing your food into the wet marsh, or blowing your scent into the wet marsh where you can be protected. And then you're looking towards the field edge, and you're looking for cruising bucks that are cruising on the downwind edge of that food. And they might move right by that food and not go out into it. And so you have to keep that in mind. So on the downwind edge, we've had a lot of downwind edge food sources that work really well. For the evening, we're blowing our scent into a ditch, off a cliff, into some type of water. So whether it's hills or flat, maybe even to open hardwoods. You have a thick line of 50 yards of thick brush, gets to open hardwoods. You come into the open hardwood side, blow your scent into the open hardwoods, face the field. You have 50 yards of brush with a couple deer trails in front of you. Perfect evening rut cruising opportunity. We are looking around because it's getting to within that 2-hour time frame where we could see some movement. And luckily Dylan's looking this way and I'm looking that way. But this is a new stand. We haven't sat here before, so that's always promising too. Hey, sorry to interrupt this video, but my web class series is finally begun. How to design your whitetail property is on my website, and there's a link in the description. Please check it out. Number 2, so you have the downwind edge. Number 2, another really good spot, of course, is between bedding and feeding. Now, the closer you get to bedding in the afternoon, the higher your risk of spooking deer out of that bedding, get into the stand, but the earlier you can expect deer movement. At the same time, the closer you get to food, the more chance you have of spooking deer out in the food. So you want to make sure you're at least 50 to 100 yards back in the cover, and you have a good way in and out without spooking the food source, because you spook the food source, you're not going to have any rut cruising in that area for a while, no matter what stand you sit in. So there's that balance. Also, the closer you get to the food source, the more you're in that funnel of movement where you might have 3 or 4 locations, bedding areas where deer are transitioning down to get towards that food source. And again, a lot of times those big bucks aren't even going out into that food source, they're just cruising by, they're looking for does. And that's where you want your food sources screened. Clear cut on public land is a good example. Deer can be feeding out there, buck actually has to go into it to search around and cruise and look for does. That's no different than a food source that's surrounded by switchgrass, hinge cuts, conifers, brush, hillside, whatever it is. He has to actually go out into the food source instead of cruising by at 100 yards and looking into it. So between bedding and feeding, I like cheating a little bit more towards the food source side in the evening so I can capture more trails coming to that food source. But again, you can't get so close that you're spooking deer away from that food source. Now, we're in a spot right here I really like, because we have a small food source, actually a little hunting plot over that way. I'd say about 75 to 100 yards. And then we have the start of a really big food plot about 150 yards this way. We're in a big bench system area. It's a point that goes out for bedding back here. This trail system funnels into the top of a draw over here, so deer cruise around the top of that draw. So we're in that location where a buck can go and check out that small food source, cruise right through here. You can bet he knows where that big food source is over there. There's apple trees, a really good food plot, huge brassicas and oats and peas and beans, and they're hitting it heavily. There's lots of scrapes around there. So they're not just going to sit there in that food source during this time of year. And that's another really important point. You know, point number 1, downside edge, downwind edge. Point number 2, closer to food source, but between bedding and feeding. And then point number 3, getting in between feeding and feeding, looking for that buck that's just checking out these food sources for does. And that brings up the last point, someplace you shouldn't sit when it comes to rut cruising, is on the food source itself. Unless it's a small food plot on the way to a big one, and you're getting a lot of movement through that plot, a true hunting plot, then you don't want to sit at that food source and have that be the last stop. It limits you. Bucks might not even go into the food. You might have 5 or 6 times more bucks that are going by the food plot and going from one to the next, cruising on the downwind edge, never stepping out on the food plot. So while those hunting plots are tempting, you're kind of pigeonholing yourself into that one little spot that you're hoping that they come right in front of you. Or right here, we have that great opportunity for bucks going in between the two. You know, if they're really cruising, if it's that time of year. Again, it's October 28th. It's a little warmer today. It's a high of 48 instead of 35 like yesterday. So I'm not expecting great movement, but we're out here in the woods, and one of the things we're doing is not only are we testing the rut cruising theories that have worked a lot of decades in the past, but we're testing out the new First Light Spectre camo, and this is a great camo. You kind of see, I call it, these are all these muted fall cover colors. You could probably see these colors right here in every tree around me. It's very muted, so it blends in, doesn't stick out. It's got a lot of light in it, so there's a good contrast, but it's their new whitetail camo that they're going towards, and I've been really happy with it. This is more of a lightweight jacket right here. I have the medium weight bibs on. I go with a heavyweight long john shirt. It's called the Furnace. I have the Furnace long johns on. Really good moisture wicking, but we're set for a good rut cruising, good camo or not. It's going to be a good night. And like I say a lot when I create these videos out in the woods like this in the season is I need to shut up, sit down, and enjoy the hunt. But I hope you enjoyed these rut cruising setup tips. Really important evening. I wanted to add, this is something I mentioned in the beginning, this is a really good morning spot too. Again, we're in a transition area in a bench with a draw coming up over here and one way over there. So deer can just go across the top of this very broad point, this bench system. We're only about 40 yards off the edge of cover, but this is also a great evening spot, or morning spot. And one of the cool things in the morning, we can hunt with our scent going this way. We can also, because it drops so far off behind the camera right here, or we can blow our scent off this drop off in the morning because the thermals are going to rise and go out over, or we can blow them out towards this field. We just can't blow them towards either food plot. Again, one food plot's about 100 yards that way, one about 150 yards that way. We're just in between this brushy area. We had a buck come through here not that long ago. We named him Wally. He's just kind of a goofy looking buck. I think if he grows up into a monster next year, we might refer to him as Walter. That sounds older and more mature. So, but he's a pretty big one. If he comes by, he might look kind of tempting tonight. So we'll see what happens. But great time to be in the woods, and this is a perfect evening rut cruising setup. We'll use it in the morning hours too, coming up during the rut. And we hope you like what you see and that makes sense. And ultimately, I hope you have a great success rate and a great fall experience this rut in 2020.